Hey Adam, today we're going to be going over 8's on Pylons. Sorry for the weird angle, I'm going to have to hold this up. Don't really have a really better place for me to do this. But anyways, so we're going over 8's on Pylons, which is a ground reference maneuver. Basically that it is two alternating turns around two pylons or points. Basically the goal of it is to be able to show airspeed control, altitude control, deviation of or separation of attention, and just basically to show how well you can fly the airplane while maintaining a line of reference to these pylons while you're in the air. So the setup of the maneuver is, first you want to clear the area. You want to make sure there's no your 3Ts. You want to make sure there's no tower, terrain, or any other traffic while in the area that you plan on doing the maneuver. You want to make sure you go over your before landing checklist or your pre-maneuver checklist, which is the same thing. And then for your setup and configuration, you want to make sure that you have around 21, and we're also going to be in the aero as well. So we'll have 21 inches manifold pressure, 2400 or 2400 RPM, as well as gear up and flaps at 0. As well as an airspeed, you want to be around 110 knots indicated is a pretty good airspeed to start off with. Just make sure you're below your maneuvering speed as well. And so during the setup, you want to first make sure that you want to first make sure you find these two pylons right here. That is going to be the toughest part of the maneuver, and is the most tedious part of the maneuver as well, because everything is dependent upon these two things, as well as your ground speed. So that determines the location, and as well as when you're doing this maneuver, you're going to be at an altitude. It's what's called pivotal altitude, which basically is an altitude that while you're in the air, say you're turning around this pylon right here, it basically is the altitude that the aircraft will pivot around this pylon. So if you were if you were flying this airplane right here and your pylon was this, say you're flying this airplane right here, this line, this basically line right here, your pylon's right here, that line right there is the altitude that would pivot around the pylon, and it is parallel to the lateral axis. It is an imaginary line that is parallel to the lateral axis of the aircraft. But basically that is the altitude. You can find it by using your ground speed squared divided by 11.3 plus your field elevation. So say if we were at 115 knots of ground speed, we do 115 squared and then divided by 11.3 because we're using knots. And then because we're doing an E-spin, the field elevation is 300, so you add 300 to that, and whatever you get is the altitude that you should start and end the maneuver at. And basically, with pivotal altitude, it'll change based on how fast or how slow you're going. So if you have an increase in ground speed, you're going to have a higher pivotal altitude. If you have a decrease in ground speed, you're going to have a lower pivotal altitude. And with the selections of these points, these 2 points, when you're selecting these points, you should have, suitable emergency landing areas, so some fields nearby, so that in case of an actual emergency, you can land within gliding distance to these areas that you select around your pylons. You may make sure that's important. It's a common error if you don't. And when you're selecting these points, there's kind of 2 different ways you can go about doing it. If you want to, some people like to fly. The wind is coming from the north right now, going to the south. So some people like to fly with the tailwind to find their points. Other people, for me, I like to fly with the headwind. So I like to fly with the headwind and see my points. So when I choose this, I like to choose one main point and then one secondary point with a couple different options around this point. That's just for me, and I'll explain why when we're getting into the maneuver. But I like to fly with a headwind. You can do either or. If you fly with a headwind, though, just remember you have this increased headwind. So you want to give your a good amount of time so that you can, when you turn around, you could get a solid ground speed as well as be able to calculate that, or if you have like a cheat sheet, be able to descend pretty using normal maneuvers and whatnot, and be able to descend or ascend to that altitude if need be. So you got these 2 points, and you also want to make sure that these points are within around between a quarter of a mile, or not a quarter, three quarters of a mile to a mile apart. If they are closer together, just know that you will have an increase when you're turning in the maneuver. You're going to have you're going to have steeper bank angle or an increased bank angle. And if they're farther apart, you'll have a lower bank angle. But when you want to make sure when you're choosing these, you want to have too steep of a bank angle, because you're not allowed to exceed more than 40 degrees of bank during this maneuver. So you got your 2 points. You're flying with a head, or now you're flying with this tailwind. Either you flying with it or you've turned around from the headwind. You're at your pivotal altitude. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to fly in between midpoints of these. Once you're midpoint, you're going to denote what heading you have, as well. So when you're in between these 2 points, you're going to turn 45 degrees to your first pylon. You're going to turn 45 degrees to it. Once you're 45 degrees, you're going to wait a couple seconds, about three seconds. Your wing's level at this point, you're going to then drop your wing. When you drop your wing, what you should notice at this point right here, you're going to have your highest ground speed and you're going to have your highest pivotal altitude. Remember, pivotal altitude changes with ground speed. So with this, because you have this tailwind, you're flying with this tailwind, you're going to have your highest pivotal altitude. As you begin this turn, remember what we talked about, maintaining that reference line. Depending on what type of wing you have, when we're talking about maintaining that reference line, for me, I like when I'm doing the maneuver, my reference line is the rivet line on the wing. The purpose of this maneuver when you're doing the maneuver is to maintain that point that you denote on your wing. For me, the rivet line. So that rivet line, maintain that line, and I want to basically pin it on that pylon when I'm in the maneuver. How I do this, though, is because of this wind change, when we're making this turn, decreasing the pivotal, losing ground speed, losing that pivotal altitude. What's going to happen is that the pylon is going to be ahead of my point, of my reference, or my wingtip. Is going to be ahead of my wingtip. And so in order to do that, I kind of think about it, I like to catch up to it. I got to catch up to it. So I put what you need to do is you need to have forward pressure control on the aircraft, which will make you lose altitude, which will basically end up to where your pylon is now back with your wingtip. Now, as we are coming, and this is increasing, you're now increasing your ground speed. It is shifting back to a tailwind. When you're doing this turn, you're going to be gaining your altitude back. You're going to be coming back to the pivotal altitude that you started at. And around this point right here, which is also the 45 to your next point, you should be roughly at the same pivotal altitude that you started as. But when you're in this turn, you're caught up to your thing, you're decreasing. Now you should be increasing altitude. What it should look like in the plane is that on your wingtip, the pylon should now be slowly starting to fall behind your wingtip. And now that you gotta slow down. You gotta let it catch back up to you. So you increase back pressure control as you gain altitude. And that is kind of how you do the maneuver, how you fly this maneuver throughout it. Once you roll out once you're flying and maintaining reference to that, as well as maintaining coordination. One of the common errors is people like to instead of increasing or decreasing altitude, they'll use excessive rudder in order to maintain that reference line, which you need to maintain coordination. You need to make sure you step on the ball or step on the brick if you have G1000, and maintain coordination throughout this entire maneuver. But you rolled out on the second 45 to the thing. So right now, on the second 45, or the 45 to your second pylon, which should be roughly 45 degrees prior to your entry heading. It'll be wings level right here. You'll be wings level coming down, wings level. And then you'll wait about 3 seconds. And assuming in a perfect world, you should be on the pylon that you said. And because now at this point, you should be at your highest ground speed and your highest pivotal altitude because you have that tailwind. And as you're turning around this one, you should be, as well as your lowest ground speed and your lowest pivotal altitude, you should be decreasing, and then you should be gaining altitude again because you're increasing ground speed because that wind is shifting to a tailwind. So you should be increasing ground speed. Your pivotal altitude should be increasing at this point, and at this point you should be at this point right here, you should be at the pivotal altitude that you started at, and as well you should exit out on the 45 degrees to your first pylon, and that is an 8's around pylon. But for example, say we're not in a perfect world though. When you come around on the second pylon, you know how I remember when I said you like to have a couple different points around here that you can choose from? That's being said is because when you get around here and you dip your wing and it's not the point, you have a couple different options to say, oh, that's my point right there. And you see, oh yeah, that one, that's the building I was talking about, when you're in the maneuver. It's just kind of not a really something I always teach, but it makes sense in the airplane because it's kind of hard when you're doing it around, in Eastman, you don't have all the points in the world to just choose from. But that's just a little cheat sheet right there. And as well, saying if you didn't calculate the correct, say your ground speed changed from when you started to when you ended, say the winds change or whatnot, you might not end up at the pivotal altitude that you started at. But it's not necessarily a bad thing because remember, if we decrease, say we started at 120 knots ground speed, we got a pivotal altitude, I'm guessing right now, of 1,600, and we ended up at 115 knots ground speed, and we were at 1,500 feet. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it makes sense that we ended up at our pivotal altitude because our ground speed decreased. Which is also why in the ACSs there's not a certain altitude that they specify. There's not a plus or minus standard of what altitude you should maintain during that. But there are some things, you can't go past 40 degrees of bank. Make sure you clear the area. Make sure that you select the correct pivotal altitude based on the ground speed you started, and to make sure you execute the maneuvers, the entry, you have the correct entry into the maneuver, and you maintain that reference line of sight with that pylon throughout the maneuver, and as well maintain coordination with it, not overusing that rudder, which is another common error, as well as another common error of not turning to the correct entries or rolling out when you need to on the correct 45-degree headings. Making sure you're not maintaining that line of sight. Those are really common things. And one that kind of jumps up around people is, not selecting suitable pylons in case of emergency. That is a really common one that I noticed when I was doing my flight training. And as well, just poor execution of the maneuver, not setting up things, not maintaining proper altitude, proper airspeed. And yeah, and that's it. Thank you.